Good evening. One of the big themes dominating discussions at the World Economic Forum in Davos has been the negative impact of both trade tariffs and excessive regulation. Now, everyone will have a different view on exactly where to draw the line between sensible rules and allowing free markets to flourish. And the US have made strong arguments in favour of tariffs as a useful tool for geopolitical negotiations. But certainly many CEOs this week have warned of the harmful effects on interfering with free trade, not least on the growth of new technologies. Well, this concern is particularly pronounced in Europe, where many of the largest economies are struggling to remain competitive. Now, as Davos comes to a close, new details have emerged revealing more about an ongoing battle between Chinese electric car makers and the European Union. Brands like BYD, Geely and Zeekr have become familiar sights on the streets of many of the world's major cities. But the speed and scale of the Chinese EV revolution is facing some major resistance from the EU. Our China correspondent Manor Babur has more now on the battle between Beijing and Brussels.
The European Court of Justice findings have been released, revealing that Chinese electric car makers BYD, Geely, and SAIC have challenged the European Union on import tariffs. China has made a complaint with the World Trade Organization against these new tariffs of 10% to 20% on Chinese EVs. The EU claims that tariffs are needed to counter the unfair subsidies that make Chinese EVs cheaper and hurt European automakers. China, however, disagrees, calling the tariffs unfair and saying they break WTO rules. This dispute shows the growing competition between China and the EU in green technologies like EVs. The EU says it's protecting its industries, and while China says it will defend its right through the WTO. The case could take years and may affect trade relations between the two sides.
Well, at Davos, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced that from next week, a new strategy called Europe's Competitiveness Compass will tackle the issue of stagnating growth. She asserted that Europe must shift gears. So how helpful is this fight with China? Is it a necessary control or another sign of the EU's economic strategy still being stuck in reverse? William Dennislow reports now from Brussels.
Guy, a spokesperson for the European Commission says it has a little over 2 months to prepare for the case and is looking forward to presenting a defence in court. Olaf Gill adds that the European Commission is a rules-based organisation and its decision to impose tariffs was the result of a lengthy facts-based investigation. Back in October, the EU imposed tariffs of up to 35% on Chinese-made EVs, on top of the 10% duty already in place. The bloc accuses China of dumping heavily subsidised cars on the European market, impacting European automakers' ability to compete. China has consistently rejected these allegations and has accused the EU of naked protectionism. BYD, Geely and SAIC have taken the EU to court over the tariff decision. And the Chinese Chamber of Commerce for Import and Export of Machinery and Electronic Products has also filed a complaint. The move was welcomed by China's Chamber of Commerce to the EU and urges both sides to accelerate negotiations. While 2024 was a record year for EV sales globally, analysts say the European market contracted by 3%. Automakers currently have until the end of the year to curb emissions or face penalties, and EU officials have floated the idea of subsidies to support the ailing sector. As the trade spat with China rolls on, EU officials say talks between the two sides continues at both a political and technical level. William Dennislow for A News in Brussels.
Well, from the hallways of political power and policy design to the day-to-day experience of car buyers on the high street, our reporter Gulchin Hojelieva investigates why so many drivers are turning to Chinese electric vehicles.
Cars like this one are an increasingly common sight in the showrooms of so many cities across the world. This dealership in Baku is typical of many places where the stock on sale has been transformed in recent years by the arrival of an increasing number of new Chinese-made electric cars. And it's not that hard to see why so many heads have been turned by these distinctive new brands. Take this car, for example. It's comfortable with a sleek design, premium leather seats, and advanced technologies like touchscreen display. And in contrast to some of its rivals from Europe, the US and Far East, it's much more affordable. But while Chinese car makers have heavy tariffs in the EU, they have a big market of people here who want luxury cars at a much lower prices. Well, Zakir Rustamov, the founder and CEO of this showroom, will speak about what's happening here. So the first question is, why are people here choosing Chinese vehicles over cars from Europe, the US and Japan?
First of all, the affordability of Chinese cars. In Azerbaijan, you can buy a brand new Chinese car starting at 20,000 AZN, while if you compare it to the same cars coming from USA or Korea, for the same amount of money, you can only buy like 7, 8, or maybe even 10 years old car. And of course, people will prefer buying a brand new car rather than the old one. And the second reason is that China currently is proving that they are making one of the best cars in the world, and people in Azerbaijan really like buying Chinese cars.
And how has the market changed in recent years?
We've been in this market since 2019, and our main import directions used to be United States of America, Korea, Georgia, and Europe. But in 2022, when our government has shifted the import tax on electric vehicles and hybrid cars, the demand has changed drastically towards import of the cars from China, because China is the biggest producer of electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles in the world.
And what do you think about EU imposing tariffs in Chinese car makers to limit their sales in Europe?
I think that there is only one reason for this, and this reason is inability to compete with Chinese colleagues. European Union is trying to protect their own producers because recently for past couple of years, biggest European producers have been making losses on their sales, and this is due to the competition with Chinese market. So the government is trying to protect their own producers.
And how likely do you think it is that in a few years the cars in Azerbaijan will be transformed with Chinese electric vehicles?
I think that if our highly respected government will prolong the cancellation of taxes on car import, especially hybrid and electric vehicles in Azerbaijan, then in the nearest future there will be around 70 or maybe even 80% of total cars there will be Chinese cars.
Thank you so much. Chinese cars like these ones are surely here to stay in Azerbaijan, and this is a good trend, both for business relations and ultimately for the planet.
Well, that is all we have time for on this edition of News Hour. Please do stay with us on A News for plenty more news and analysis. And from all of us here in Baku, we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.